Fair warning, some of these tales may haunt you long after you've heard them. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The Haunted Locket. It started as an ordinary evening when Emily stepped into her local dollar store. A mix of boredom and curiosity had led her there. She thought she might find some hidden gems or quirky items to pass the time. As she wandered the aisles, the fluorescent lights above her flickered intermittently, giving the store a faintly eerie atmosphere. In the back corner of the store, hidden behind rows of generic party decorations, she stumbled upon an aisle she had never noticed before. The items here were strange, out of place. Dust-covered porcelain dolls with cracked faces stared blankly from the shelves, and old, faded books with no discernible titles sat stacked haphazardly. Emily felt a chill crawl up her spine, but curiosity won out. As she reached for an unusual trinket, a tarnished locket with no price tag, an elderly clerk appeared seemingly out of nowhere. His pale face and sunken eyes gave Emily an unsettling feeling. "That locket doesn't belong to you," he said in a hoarse whisper. Emily chuckled nervously. "Isn't everything in the store for sale?" The clerk's lips twisted into a strange smile. "Not that." It was returned, unnerved, but determined not to let her imagination get the better of her. Emily left the locket where it was and moved on. As she browsed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows danced in her peripheral vision, and faint whispers seemed to follow her every step. Finally, she grabbed a few harmless items, candles, batteries, and a notebook, and made her way to the checkout. The elderly clerk scanned her items in silence, his piercing gaze fixed on her face. When she paid and turned to leave, he muttered something under his breath, so faint she barely caught it. "You've been marked." "What did you say?" she asked, turning back, but the clerk was gone. That night, Emily dismissed the entire experience as an overactive imagination. Yet, as the hours ticked by, strange things began happening in her apartment. Her newly purchased candles flickered with an unnatural intensity, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move independently of the flames. The notebook she bought opened on its own, pages flipping as if caught in a strong breeze, though the windows were closed. By midnight, Emily was gripped with fear. Then she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible knock at her door. Peeking through the peephole, she saw no one. When the knock came again, louder this time, she called out, "Who's there?" but received no reply. In a desperate attempt to calm her nerves, she grabbed the notebook and opened it. Scrawled across the pages in jagged handwriting was a single phrase repeated over and over. "Return what isn't yours." Emily's blood ran cold. She remembered the locket in the dollar store, the one she hadn't taken. But she hadn't touched it. Her mind reeled as the knocking at her door grew more frantic. Suddenly, the lights in her apartment went out, plunging her into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, she heard it again, not knocking, but a low, rasping breath just behind her. Turning slowly, she saw it, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes, its skeletal hand reaching for her. Emily's scream echoed into the night, but no one came to help. The next morning, the store clerk stood in the same aisle where Emily had seen the locket. It sat once more on the shelf, its tarnished surface glowing faintly in the pale light. Another customer walked by, their curious eyes landing on the strange trinket. The clerk said nothing, but his twisted smile returned as they reached for the locket. And so, the cycle began again. The cursed music box. It was a stormy evening when Ethan decided to pull over at a dilapidated dollar store on the outskirts of town. The rain was relentless, blurring his windshield and making the roads treacherous. The store's flickering neon signs seemed to beckon him, and with nothing better to do, he stepped inside to wait out the storm. The air inside was damp and carried the faint scent of mildew. The store was poorly lit, with a few flickering fluorescent lights casting unsettling shadows across the cramped aisles. Shelves were cluttered with cheap goods, from plastic toys to faded greeting cards. A faint buzzing sound came from somewhere above, adding to the eerie quiet. Behind the counter stood the clerk. He was gaunt, with hollow cheeks and pale skin that almost glowed under the store's harsh lights. His dark eyes didn't move from Ethan as he wandered through the aisles. Something about his gaze unsettled Ethan, but he brushed it off as his imagination. As Ethan browsed, he came across an odd section near the back of the store. The items here were different, older, dustier, and far more peculiar. An ornate music box caught his eye. It seemed to be carved from dark wood, its intricate patterns and brass inlays far too sophisticated for a dollar store. The crank was slightly rusted, but the craftsmanship was undeniable. Ethan picked it up, curious. "You don't want that?" Ethan jumped, startled by the clerk's sudden appearance. He hadn't heard the man approach. "It's just a music box," Ethan replied, laughing nervously. "Isn't everything here for sale?" "Some things," the clerk said, his voice low and even, "come with a price you're not ready to pay." His sunken eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Ethan hesitated, but eventually set the box down. "Suit yourself," he muttered, brushing past the clerk and heading to the front to pay for a soda and some chips. As the clerk rang him up, Ethan noticed a strange symbol tattooed on the man's wrist, a swirling design that seemed to shift slightly under the fluorescent light. Before he could ask about it, the transaction was done, and the clerk handed him his change without another word. That night, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the music box. It felt as though it had called to him, its melody already playing faintly in his mind, even though he'd never heard it. The storm had subsided, but the unease lingered. By midnight, he couldn't resist any longer. He grabbed his keys and drove back to the store. This time, the lights inside were off, but the door was unlocked. Pushing it open, Ethan stepped into the darkness. The store seemed emptier than before, the air colder. Navigating by the light of his phone, he found the peculiar aisle and the music box, sitting exactly where he'd left it. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and left. Back at home, Ethan placed the music box on his nightstand and turned the crank. A haunting melody filled the room, delicate yet dissonant. But as the song played, strange things began to happen. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, and whispers filled the air. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't quite understand. He tried to stop the music, but the crank wouldn't budge. Suddenly, the lights in his apartment flickered and went out. In the darkness, the melody grew louder, almost deafening. Then he heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood, coming from the hallway. Ethan froze, his breath hitching. Slowly, he turned toward the door. Standing in the doorway was the clerk, but he looked different. His eyes were pitch black, and his pale skin was stretched impossibly tight over his skull. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin as he stepped into the room. "I warned you," the clerk said, his voice echoing unnaturally. Ethan stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp as the shadows in the room coalesced into something solid. Dark, twisted forms emerged from the walls, their clawed hands reaching for him. He grabbed the music box and tried to smash it against the floor, but it remained intact, the melody growing louder and more distorted with every passing second. The clerk leaned in closer, his icy breath chilling Ethan to the bone. "You took what wasn't yours. Now we'll take you." The shadows enveloped Ethan, their cold, suffocating presence silencing his screams. The last thing he saw was the clerk's grinning face before darkness consumed him completely. The next morning, the music box was back on the shelf in the dollar store, its brass inlays gleaming faintly. The clerk stood behind the counter, his expression as blank as ever. When a curious customer reached for the box, his lips curled into a smile. Dollar store fortune teller. Jessica had never been one for superstitions, but the idea of a kitschy fortune-telling machine at her local dollar store piqued her interest. She was wandering the aisles, searching for cheap decorations for a party, when she stumbled upon it. The machine was wedged awkwardly between stacks of seasonal items and a shelf of expired-looking candy. It was ancient, with peeling paint and a faded label that read, "Madame Viola, your future awaits." The mannequin inside the glass case was unsettling. Its porcelain face had cracks running through it, and one glassy eye seemed to stare directly at Jessica. Still, she couldn't resist. The machine promised a fortune for just $1, and the absurdity of it all made her smile. She slid a crumpled bill into the slot. The machine buzzed and whirred, its mechanisms grinding like they hadn't been oiled in decades. The mannequin's hand jerked forward, as though offering something, and a small card slid out from a slip below. Jessica plucked the card, laughing at her own silliness. But the laughter faded as she read the words printed in ornate, smudged lettering. "You will die by your own hands tonight." A chill ran down her spine. She glanced around, expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But the store was empty, except for an employee lazily stocking shelves in the distance. Shaking off the unease, she slipped the card into her pocket and walked away. That night, Jessica's apartment felt unusually cold. The heat was on, but the chill seemed to seep through the walls, tangible and oppressive. She sat on her couch, nursing a mug of tea, when she remembered the fortune card. Pulling it from her pocket, she stared at the cryptic message. The words seemed darker now, as though the ink had deepened, and the card felt heavier. She dismissed the thought with a nervous laugh. But then the shadows in her living room began to shift. At first, she thought it was a trick of the dim light, but the movement became more deliberate. A tall, gaunt shadow stretched across the room, separate from her furniture or the dim glow of her lamps. She froze. "Jessica." Her name was whispered in a voice like dried leaves scraping against pavement. Her heart raced as she looked around, but she saw nothing. Then she noticed her reflection in the mirror across the room. It was wrong. Her reflection wasn't sitting still. It was staring directly at her, grinning in a way she knew she wasn't. The smile was too wide, too unnatural. The longer she looked, the more the reflection didn't resemble her at all. The shadow behind her reflection began to grow. It morphed into something monstrous. Hollow eyes, elongated limbs, and a grotesque grin that mirrored the one on her reflection's face. Jessica screamed and threw her mug at the mirror, shattering it. Desperate to escape, she ran to her bedroom and locked the door. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she tried to convince herself it was all in her head. But then she heard it, a faint, melodic tune. It sounded like an old music box, the kind that winds down and distorts the melody into something haunting. The sound was coming from her pocket. Jessica hesitated, then reached in to find the fortune card. It was vibrating slightly, as if alive. When she held it up, the words had changed. "The clock strikes 12. The knife will fall." Panic overwhelmed her as she looked at the time, 11:59 p.m. The melody grew louder, and with it came whispers. They were soft at first, but grew in intensity until they were a cacophony of voices screaming unintelligible words. In the chaos, Jessica noticed her own shadow on the bedroom wall. It moved, but she hadn't. The shadow turned toward her, bending at unnatural angles, its movements sharp and deliberate. She backed away as the shadow reached toward the nightstand, where a small kitchen knife rested. "No," she screamed, but her shadow grasped the knife. She felt the weight of it in her hand, as though she were holding it herself. No matter how much she tried to let go, her fingers wouldn't obey. The clock struck midnight. The next morning, the police found Jessica's body in her bedroom. The scene was puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry, and the only item out of place was a small, old fortune card on the nightstand. It read, "Fortunes foretold can't be undone." The dollar store replaced the broken fortune-telling machine a week later. Customers walked by without a second glance, except for one curious man who slipped $1 into the slot. The machine buzzed, and the mannequin's cracked hand jerked forward, offering him a card. His face paled as he read, "You're next." The forgotten customer. On a foggy autumn evening, a single mother named Clara stopped by the local dollar store to pick up last-minute items for her son's school project. It was late, and the store was eerily empty, save for the sound of the wind rattling the glass doors. Clara grabbed her supplies quickly, some glue, markers, and construction paper, and headed toward the checkout counter. As she reached the register, she noticed an old woman standing in the corner of the store, partially obscured by shadows. The woman was dressed in outdated clothes, a long, faded dress and a moth-eaten shawl draped over her shoulders. Her bony hands clutched a large paper bag. Clara tried not to stare, but something about the woman's presence made her uneasy. She seemed wrong, like she didn't belong. "Late for shopping, aren't we?" the cashier said with a grin, snapping Clara back to reality. He was a young man, cheerful and chatty, which helped ease her nerves. As the cashier scanned her items, Clara glanced back toward the corner, but the old woman was gone. A faint chill ran down her spine. She quickly paid and left the store, clutching her bag tightly. That night, Clara sat at the kitchen table, helping her son with his project. As they worked, she felt an unshakable sense of being watched. She chalked it up to exhaustion until her son pointed toward the window and asked, "Mom, who's that?" Clara's blood ran cold. Outside, barely visible in the mist, was the old woman from the store. She was standing perfectly still, her face hidden in shadow. Clara jumped up and locked the door, pulling the curtains closed. The following morning, Clara returned to the dollar store to report the incident. The cheerful cashier was gone, replaced by a somber middle-aged woman. When Clara described the old woman she had seen, the new cashier's face turned pale. "You saw her," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "That's impossible." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, her unease growing. The cashier hesitated before speaking. "Years ago, an old woman came in here every evening, always buying strange things. Candles, mirrors, rope. Then one day, she disappeared. We thought she moved away, but sometimes people say they see her here. Late at night, always watching." Clara left the store feeling shaken. That night, as she was tucking her son into bed, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the room grew deathly cold. A faint rustling sound came from the living room, like dry leaves scraping across the floor. Clara grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Then she saw it, the large paper bag sitting on the kitchen counter. She hadn't brought it home, and she knew it hadn't been there before. Inside the bag was a collection of items: candles, a broken mirror, and a piece of frayed rope. At the bottom, scrawled on a yellowed piece of paper, was a single word: return. The lights flickered back on, and Clara gasped. The old woman was standing in the hallway, her face a ghastly mask of decay. Her hollow eyes bore into Clara's soul as she whispered, "You shouldn't have taken what's mine." The next day, Clara returned the paper bag to the store and begged the cashier to take it. The woman refused, her hands trembling. "That's her curse, not mine." From that night on, Clara and her son heard whispers in the shadows, felt cold spots in their home, and saw fleeting glimpses of the old woman in mirrors and windows. No matter what Clara did, the haunting persisted, growing more intense with each passing day. One evening, desperate and terrified, Clara threw the bag into a nearby river. For a moment, she felt relief, until she turned and saw the old woman standing on the riverbank, clutching the bag once more. The last anyone heard from Clara, she had abandoned her house and moved far away. But locals say the dollar store still carries the woman's curse. Late at night, if you wander too far into the back aisles, you might feel a cold breath on your neck or hear a soft, raspy whisper, "Return what's mine." The curse of the Grim Reaper. The evening air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and old candy wrappers as Sarah wandered into the dollar store. It was Halloween night, and the store, normally a cheerful place of low-priced goods, had transformed into something else entirely. The bright overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. Every aisle was filled with cheap plastic decorations, ghouls, skeletons, and masks, all of which looked like they had been discarded from someone's nightmare. But it was the center of the store that caught her attention, a towering figure of the Grim Reaper, standing ominously next to the candy aisle. The dark, tattered cloak billowed with a supernatural force, even though there was no breeze. Its hollow, black eyes seemed to glimmer, as if there was something alive within them. The scythe, made of black plastic, was eerily well crafted, and it seemed to sway ever so slightly, though no one was near it. Sarah couldn't look away. Her feet moved against her will, as if drawn toward the figure. The murmur of her thoughts was drowned out by a strange, low hum that seemed to emanate from the Reaper itself. It wasn't the store's usual background noise. It was something deeper, more primal. Her pulse quickened. She felt a cold chill wrap itself around her spine, as though the store had suddenly plunged into a cryptic, frozen darkness. As Sarah approached the Reaper, her hands trembled. She reached out, feeling the strange static in the air. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw its eyes move. Just a twitch, a shift in direction. But it couldn't be. No, it was just her imagination, right? Then the whisper came. It wasn't a voice, more like a whispering wind, but colder than anything she had ever felt. A voice without words, yet somehow she understood. "You shouldn't be here." The whisper echoed inside her head, icy and uninviting. Frozen in place, Sarah could feel her heartbeat racing, but her legs refused to move. The scythe's blade, once hanging motionless, dipped lower, almost brushing the ground, and she could swear the figure was slowly leaning toward her. "Leave now." The voice again, but now it was clear, spoken directly into her ear. She whipped around, but no one was behind her. The aisles were empty, just rows and rows of dusty shelves. Her breath came in sharp, panicked gasps. She had to get out now. With her legs shaking, she turned and bolted toward the exit, the sound of her footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the empty store. But as she ran, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Reaper was watching her. She dared not look back. Outside, she slammed the door behind her and leaned against it, gasping for air. The cool night air did little to calm her nerves. The image of the Reaper's cold, empty eyes haunted her mind, burning into her thoughts. That night, sleep eluded Sarah. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Reaper's face, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. At first, it was just the fleeting sensation of someone watching her from the shadows. But as the hours wore on, things began to escalate. The whispers came again, faint at first, then louder, echoing through the dark corners of her room. She shot upright in bed, heart pounding, as the wind outside picked up. Her bedroom door creaked open, though she was certain she had locked it. She couldn't move. Fear paralyzed her. Then she saw it, a shadow in the corner of her room, slowly taking form. It was tall, dark, and impossibly still. The figure from the store, the Reaper, stood there, his hollow eyes fixated on her. The scythe gleamed in the dim light, its edge sharper than ever before. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, his footfall silent but heavy, as if the very ground beneath him quaked. "You took something," the voice rasped, but this time it was in her ear, cold and sharp. "You took something that was never meant to be yours." Her breath caught in her throat. The Reaper was real. It wasn't just a Halloween decoration. Sarah tried to stand, to run, but her body was immobilized. It was as though the Reaper's gaze had already claimed her. She felt herself being pulled, dragged through the floor. Desperately, she reached for the walls, but they were slick and cold, offering no grip. "You belong to me now," the whisper echoed, but it was not just in her ear. It was in her very soul. The figure reached out with his skeletal hand, his fingers cold and sharp as they wrapped around her wrist. With a final, chilling pull, everything went black. The next morning, the dollar store was just as ordinary as any other. The Halloween decorations were still up, the skeletons hanging on the walls, the ghoulish masks leering from the shelves. But there was one noticeable difference. The Reaper's figure was gone, and in its place, a new display. This time a plastic locket, tarnished and old, sitting on the shelf by the candy aisle. It had no price tag, but Sarah's name was etched on the back. The clerk, with his vacant eyes, watched from behind the counter, a twisted smile curving his lips. He knew the cycle would continue. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.